Hello. I don't know if anyone can hear me because you can't see me or anything. Oh, here we go, man. I don't know. It's weird to me. I'm just gonna say that. I know that pretty much every tour, everything that we see right now in the world, they all start by saying everything's weird. And I'm just gonna get this right out of the way, right out the gate. This is super weird to give a tour where I cannot see anyone. I cannot see any people. I'm in my basement right now with a nice cup of tea. It's the first time I've ever given a tour from my basement. First time I've ever given a tour without wearing pants. There you go. Oh, that's a joke. So, hopefully you'll work with me a little bit on this completely new format. I'm used to being able to see people, have some sort of interaction. I know that you can make like comments. Oh, I see some people. Oh, people are like commenting. Oh my God. Here's the thing. I'm going to be giving a tour and I'm not going to look at the comments for a while. You can totally comment all you want. It'll be great. It'll be super fun. Thing is that I'm going to be kind of focused on doing all this stuff. At the end, if you have like questions, then I'll go back and then I'll like look and I'll try and answer some questions. Or I'll say hi, or I'll like something. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what this thing is. This is crazy. So yeah, I had this, and I think you probably know, us tour guides are hurting a little bit for work at this point. And I was thinking a lot about like other ways that I could give a tour or something else that I could do. And since I've worked in two different cities, then I thought that this would be kind of the ideal way to explore new formats and try and give a tour of both cities at the same time. And I think that one thing that happened, so I've been a tour guide, for those that don't know me, besides the like 6 people that are watching that are my friends and family, but if you don't know who I am, then I've been a tour guide for about 6 years, and I was a tour guide down in New Orleans for about 5 years. And then I've been a tour guide here in New York for about a year. And when I moved here to New York for like a change of scenery, I was like, I want to do something different, but I want to do it the same thing in a different place. Then one thing that I realized is that there was actually a lot more similarities of doing tours here than I ever thought there'd be. And that was good and bad, but mostly good. But what I kind of came across was that there's some really strong similarities that I kind of want to go over and do like this kind of crazy little bonkers multimedia whole extravaganza thing. I know that I promised in my poster, if you saw that I would be that I drew things, and I started to draw things, and they were really bad. Not a drawer. I mean, like there's levels of bad. There's bad, and then there's like so bad that it's not even funny, and you just pity the person bad, and that's where it was landing. So instead, I did more of a multimedia thing. I did draw a few things just because I know, I promised. And what kind of tour guide would I be if I don't do what I promised? So basically, I'm kind of setting this tour up. We're going to be going through both cities, but I want to do it in like kind of 4 different sections of similarities. 4 different sections of similarities. And the first section, by the way, these are going to get more controversial, more crazy as they go on. But the first one may be a little basic and simple because we have to kind of start that way. So the first thing, water, walls, fires. You can see why you don't want me actually drawing anything, because this is what happens when I try and draw something. But we're going to just jump right in. And I know that you don't know what to expect. Here's the thing. I got this whole kind of thing set up, just like that. And so we're going to be doing kind of this virtual multimedia sort of extravaganza experience that I got going on right here. And we're going to be bouncing between those 2 cities. And I really, man, if you don't know which one is which, then we're going to need to like backtrack. You should probably like pause this video and do a little more research on your own. But we're going to start off and we're going to talk a little bit about those concepts: water, walls, and fire. All right. First of all, we're going to go to New York. That's where I'm living now. So that's where we're going to start off. What you're looking at is a very high level view from above of the city of New York, right? So this is all around the area of New York. And what we're seeing, high above, we can't even do this on a normal tour. So in that way, it's kind of cool that we got this. I am going to put this on pause for one quick second because I need to do something. One quick second. Sorry about that. Just wanted to take care of a little technical thing. All right, we're back. We're setting it up. We got it all going on. So we're looking at New York. We're looking at New York from like above, right? And I know this is a little kind of complicated and weird. So what I want to show you is I want to kind of zoom into a picture. So we got a picture going on right there of all the different boroughs. And with all these different boroughs that we're looking at, you can see there's Staten Island, there's Brooklyn, there's Queens, there's the Bronx, and there's Manhattan. And if you've ever sat there and wondered to yourself, and you sat there and been like, what the heck is a borough? What is this? What's going on there? A borough was really just one of the original cities of New York, all right? That's what it was. That's all it was. So when you see a borough and you're like, what the heck is a borough? Just know that it was one of the original cities of New York right there. And so, I'm sorry, I got to do this one more time, one more quick little thing. Okay, so sorry about that. Just another technical thing. This should be all fixed at this point right there, right? So I think we're all good. So, whoop, whoop, whoop. All right, great. We're back. This is just what it's like on a tour. By the way, I have the same thing where I'm just like, okay, wait, guys, and then I come back. But anyway, so what we're looking at is all of the boroughs, and these all used to be different cities. And what's really important is this first word that we're talking about, water, right there. All the water surrounding the whole area. This is pretty basic, but as you can kind of see in this bay area right there, this is a beautiful harbor. If you've ever been to New York, when the Dutch first came here, they explored, they found that this was like an incredible harbor that they walked into. This is one of the best natural harbors in the world. And I need to back up for just 1 second because I just talked about the Dutch and I made a huge mistake because the Dutch were not the first people that ever came to this area, right? I hope that you all know that. The Dutch were not the first people that came here, and every tour that I give, you have to talk about the actual first people that were here, which were not the Dutch. It was the Lenape and the Canarsie tribes. Now, they originally would not have called this Manhattan. There's this idea that Manhattan means like the land of rolling hills, and maybe it does, but that wasn't like what they were calling it. That's just one of the ideas that was put onto it by the explorers. So what this really was is the Dutch come in, and there were already people living here, and it was the Lenape for the most part. Quick sidebar. If you've ever heard this very common myth that's been repeated that says that the Dutch bought the entire island of Manhattan for $24, I need you to surgically remove that from your brain and never think about that ever again. Because that is one of the biggest myths that I've ever heard. The Dutch, if you believe that the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan for $24, you should also believe that I bought the island of Manhattan for $24. And then you're going to sit here and you're going to go, Kyle, that's crazy. You couldn't have bought the island of Manhattan for $24. Where's your proof? And I'll tell you, I have a journal entry that I wrote from a few months ago, and it has all the details there. Just follow that. Andrew Cuomo and I worked it out. I paid $24. I got the entire island of Manhattan. Quick sidebar. Anyway, we're talking about the Dutch. We're talking about the original colony, and this is what you see, all of these different colonies that would be right here, the different cities of New York. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit. Technology. We're going to zoom in a little bit, and where we're going is to that very, very tippy bottom of the island of Manhattan. And this is what you're seeing right there. This is like modern day view. But when you actually look, this would kind of give a demonstration of the land throughout time. So all of this green area around here, that was the original land. The orangish area was all added land later on, right? So greenish area, original. The orangish area, this was all added on later on. And so really what you would have seen in the original colony was just something that looked like this. This road right over here, you've probably heard of before. It's called Broadway. Broadway actually snakes up the entirety of Manhattan Island. It was the original American Indian walking path that the Dutch stole from the American Indians. So there's another theme for you right there too. Now, when you overlay this onto the actual island itself, Broadway is really kind of right here. And then what you're seeing on is from over here, this would be kind of the end of the island, and then they filled all that in. This is called Water Street right here. And I have to tell you something right now. New Yorkers are terrible at naming things. We are the absolute worst at naming things. And this is actually going to be one of the strong differences between New York and New Orleans, is New Orleans is super good at naming things. Almost all of their streets, everything you go around, they have unpronounceable names for almost everything. And the more things you can pronounce, the more local you are. And in New York, they do not have time to name anything fancy. They're like, I don't know, man, there was water there once. What do you want from me? It's Water Street, right? Additionally into that, we're going to kind of zoom into this street right above. And as you can see on this map right there at the very top, there was a wall at the top. And I bet you can probably imagine the name of the street that turns out to be, right? It turns out to be Wall Street. So this is really crazy, right? Because it's like we're actually on a tour via Google. And we've like flashed back in time, because I guarantee you this would not look like this with all these people. This is now a historical photo that you are looking at back when people used to be outside and I wasn't giving tours from my basement. But this is on Wall Street that we're looking at. And if you were to look around, this is kind of like one of the epicenters of tourism of New York. So if you were to look around, you can see up over here, this is Federal Hall Monument. It wasn't the original Federal Hall. This is the monument. And then when you look kind of back around this way, you can see the New York Stock Exchange building. And when you look back behind you right there, then you can see that's Trinity Church. So there's like a bunch of stuff all around over here. So if we were to be doing a tour, then this would be a major spot if we could actually go places outside with our time. But what you're looking down below right over here is all these kind of posts, all these spots right there. This markates where the wall would have been. Now, you can see it's a wall. I know, you're like, Kyle, why are you showing me pictures of a wall? But this is what it is, pictures of the wall. That's what it would have looked like. Now, let's get this straight. American Indians first, right? Always. American Indians first. Then the Dutch. Then it was the British. Then it was the Dutch. Then it was the British. Then it was the Americans. That's the brief little roller coaster ride you would have seen. The Dutch originally built this wall, and they built this wall to keep out the British. And I just told you how completely ineffective it was at actually keeping out the British, right? Because not only did the British invade once, they invaded twice. They got in twice. So the British got around the wall magically by boats and water. So it was a fairly ineffective wall. You'll actually kind of maybe see some similarities there with New Orleans as well. But review quickly before we go to New Orleans for a little bit. We haven't talked about fires yet. Water and walls. Okay. So now we're going to do this magical thing that we wouldn't normally be able to do, and we're going to kind of zoom all the way over to a completely different city on a completely different side of the country, way in the south. And this is the bird's eye view of New Orleans is what you're looking at. Again, pops right off the page, water, right? So you got all the water way up here. This is Lake Pontchartrain. And then you got the snaking Mississippi River. Now, the French, when they settled into New Orleans, again, this was all about water. For New York, they settled in one of the most beautiful natural harbors in the world. It just so happened to be that way. New Orleans, they probably could not have picked a worse place to create a city if they tried. This is one of the crazy things, is New Orleans kind of has survived in spite of all of its incredible technical challenges, because they built it essentially on marshland. And there were hurricanes, there were tons of mosquitoes, there's yellow fever going all throughout the whole area. And so because of that, I need to kind of just show you what we're looking at. Now this, what you're seeing, is basically a cross section. There's a big misconception, and people will say that New Orleans is almost entirely below sea level, and that's not entirely accurate. There are parts of it that are below sea level, but for the most part, it's kind of rides at or about sea level. This is sea level. That's the river. This is the lake back over there. But what's really important to understand is when the French settled, they settled in this kind of tippy top right on over here. This is the highest ground of the entire city, and it's where they settled. There's kind of a joke that people will tell along the tour guide circuit of New Orleans. You didn't know there's a tour guide circuit, but there totally is. And they'll say that, you know, of course, New Orleans, the highest ground of the entire city, is about 9 feet above sea level. And you know what we put at the highest ground of the entire city? An aquarium. And so that's not my joke. There's a lot of joke theft in tour guiding. But anyway, so we're going to kind of zoom in, and we're going to go to where all those little arrows are. We're going to where the French Quarter is. This is the original settlement that the French created. Now, we again made a grave sin, and we started talking about the colonists before we talked about the actual people who were there first. This would be the Choctaw Indians. The American Indians of the Choctaw actually had a trading post and their own version of a city called Bulbancha that would be located kind of back around over here. And again, when the French come in, they say, hey guys, where's a really great place to start a city? And the American Indians knew that it was going to be in this spot. So this is why the French originally settled there, is they took the idea from the American Indians. So what you're looking at, again, this is bounded by this street, let's use this street, and this street. That's what you're bounded up by, and that's the entirety of the French Quarter. Again, there was a wall. So this is one of the earlier maps of New Orleans of the French Quarter, right? So you got a wall, boop, 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 all around over there. Now, what's really important is that this wall was also kind of ineffective in that there was a major problem with it, that it was trying to keep people out, but unfortunately in this awful event, it ended up keeping people in. And this is the fire of 1788, which was one of the defining characteristics of New Orleans architecture. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Hope everything's going well. Let me check and see how this is looking. Hello, people are talking. Oh, wow. I hope everybody is having a good time. Anyway. All right. So what we're looking at right here is an example of what you'd see walking around the French Quarter, right? You'd see all these buildings while you're walking around the French Quarter. They look a lot like this. So this would be an example of what most people think is, most people would get this incorrect. Most people, when they look at this, they go, well, it was the French that settled there, so it must be French architecture. And that is incorrect. Because the way this went in New Orleans was that it went French, then Spanish, then French, then Americans, right? And in that weird time of the Spanish, there was an awful fire that happened called the Fire of 1788. And the fire of 1788 burned down a lot of buildings. And if you're looking at this and you're saying, how could it burn down these buildings that are made of brick? Because it didn't actually look like that. They would have actually looked more like this building right back over here. This is called Madame John's Legacy, right? And this building, what you're seeing right over here, this is built out of wood, and this would be more of the French colonial style of architecture. Now, the building that was there did burn down. This did not survive the fire, but it gives you a sense of what these buildings would have looked like. And what happens is the fire comes through, tears through the entire area, and most of these buildings built out of wood were built out of not just wood, but cypress wood. Strong, durable, keeps out all the termites, but is very flammable. So they start going up, and then the real tragedy hits. Most people had private little illegal stockpiles of gunpowder. So when the fire hits that, it explodes at even a bigger rate. And 80% of the buildings in that one fire are destroyed. The walls surrounding the city actually trapped the people inside as they were trying to escape. Now, there were actually very few deaths in this fire. It still would be horrific, but there were very few deaths. Most people were able to kind of go into one of the corners or down by the river to get away from that. But still, what happens is this was a defining event for New Orleans because all the buildings used to look like this. Everything gets burned. They start to rebuild. And then there's another fire that burns down all the buildings all over again in 1794. So New Orleans is like, all right, you got to figure this out. The Spanish are in charge. They say, well, this is what you're going to do. You're going to now build the buildings with brick, and you're going to put a stucco on the outside, and that's going to solve our big, huge fire problem. So that, remember that, fire of 1788, defining event for the architecture of New Orleans. There was also a fire in New York about 12 years earlier in the fire of 1776. And weirdly, this actually destroyed almost the same number of buildings as the fire of 1788. But New York was a lot bigger, so it only destroyed about 20% of the entire city at that time. So there was an event, and we're kind of wrapping up this first section, but I do want to tell you one more fun story. There was an event, there was something that actually did define the architecture for New York. And I want to show you and tell you that story before we move on to the second section of this virtual tour where I can see no people and it just feels like I'm talking in the basement to myself. Because I guess technically that is what I'm doing. So, this building had actually probably one of the biggest revolutions for New York in terms of the building styles. It had nothing to do with fires. I know where fires, there was a fire, but the real revolution that happened inside of this building, this is the location in New York of the first passenger elevator in the world. And I know when I talk about this and you're just sitting there yelling at your computer, as I imagine you're doing. I don't know what you're doing, but I imagine you're like, Kyle, you just told us a story about a fire, and now you're downgrading us to a story about an elevator. I actually like this story better, believe it or not. The story of the elevator is an incredible story that goes back to 1858. And it does have to do with this building, but first we have to know there's a guy whose name was Elisha Otis. If you've ever been on an elevator, you've seen the name Otis stamped on the elevator, is the same guy right there. Elisha Otis was a doll maker. And freight elevators existed. Elevators before him existed. They were for materials, right? So let's say you had manufacturing on one of the top floors, and let's say you want to cut down your time. You have an elevator installed. It brings the things up and then you bring it down. It's kind of a boring little thing, but that's what it does. No one would ever ride on that because these were terrifying devices that broke all the time. So you push the button, it goes up, all comes clattering down, breaks, the cable snaps, everyone's terrified. The idea of riding on an elevator was terrifying. No one would ever do that. Why would you ever do that, right? So Elisha Otis says, guys, I think we can ride on elevators. The problem is that there's no braking mechanism to stop the elevator from falling all the way down. So what he does is he invents the braking mechanism to stop the elevator from falling. Now he invents this and he puts it on the market. Nobody buys. Cricket sounds, right? They're sitting there, they're being like, that's a death trap, man. There's no way that I'm going to get on your crazy elevator. That's insane. So Elisha Otis decides, all right, I got to step this up a notch. And there just so happens to be a World's Fair going on in 1858. And he does a demonstration. And the demonstration goes like this. He stands on an elevator platform in front of a huge crowd of people. Now, all the people are already freaking out because they're like, hey, if we know one thing about elevators, you never ride on them. What are you doing? That's insane. And you can see the hubbub painted here, drawn here. And my favorite is this guy. I hope you can kind of see that. This guy right here who's got the most sour face ever. He's like, you know. And everyone's sitting there, they're like, get off the elevator. What are you doing? What are you doing? And then Elisha Otis does something even crazier. He says, you know what I'm going to do? He calls to the person behind him who has a machete. This person with the machete cuts through the rope, holding up the elevator platform. The platform starts to fall. All the people in the audience scream. And then braking mechanism engages. Round of applause. Elisha Otis is a millionaire overnight. And the reason why I'm pointing out this particular building is because this is the location of the first passenger elevator. And so what they do is they install the elevator in this building. And this was like an amusement park ride. Now this was just a department store. This is all it was. But this was like an amusement park ride. People were freaking out. They really wanted to go, so much so they actually waited in line for hours. People would get dressed up. Like a dude would like put on his nice suit and like the nice hat because he like wants to impress the elevator. People would be like waiting in line for hours. They'd get all the way to the end of the line. They'd go up one story, be in a department store, and that was it right there. But this was really a big game changer because this starts to get people thinking differently. Because rich people used to live on the first story, right? Made the poor people walk on the stairs above. Everything gets flipped, gets inverted. People start living taller, start thinking taller. Everything starts being taller and taller and taller. So this was really one of the biggest inventions that really defined the architecture for New York as well. And you couldn't really do this without mentioning one quick other thing, that actually the ground in New York supports this. So the ground in New York, this is a type of rock that's called schist, not the bad word, schist. And this is extremely strong rock. You actually have to use dynamite if you want to kind of blast into that. And all of New York is kind of based off of this type of rock. And so it's very easy for them to build extremely tall buildings because they have foundation everywhere. This is compared to New Orleans, which is actually built on alluvial soil, which is like no bedrock. Everything kind of shifts around. And if they want to build a big tall building, they have to like build their own kind of foundation to do that right there. But long time to talk, and we're only on the first section, but I want to kind of like review water, walls, fire. I don't know if there's too many things that I'm doing, but I had this crazy idea the other day that I'm going to kind of compare. And so I want to kind of do, why not? There's no one else here. There's no one to tell me that this is a terrible idea, so I'm going to do it. This is kind of like, I actually haven't yet equalize this out, so maybe it'll turn out they're actually more different than the same. But I want to kind of do a running tally right here. So big similarities. I'm going to give me the three because I don't want to say differently. This is also kind of like whose land is it anyway rules that we're doing. So 1, 2, 3. Waters, walls, fire. There were some differences though, right? The land, I'll give them that. Different cultures with different religions, sure, I'll give them that. Oh, I'll also give them, why not? I'll give them the fact that they like name things weird. Why not? Well, it's even. It's an even score right now. But I want to get into a lot of those, and I know some of you guys are like, water, walls, fire. All right, guys. A lot of cities had water, a lot of cities had walls, a lot of cities had fires. I don't know if I really am going to give it to you. I think that this next one is going to like totally solve that problem, and I think really you have to give me this next one, because the next similarity that I want to talk about iconic structures built by women. Now, this is not just like a building that was built the other day. In both New York and in New Orleans, some of the most iconic buildings of the entire city were built in the mid to late 1800s by women, which even today, we are not quite at the point where women are recognized for being able to build at that level. And this was all the way back in the mid 1800s. So I want to just tell you those two stories before we move on to the next one, of the two different buildings that were started there. And to start off this, we're going to go down to New Orleans. We're going to use our magic to go back down to New Orleans. So we're traveling. This would be like we're walking between stops, I guess. I don't know what I'm doing, man. This is a crazy tour. I've also never given this particular tour, and it's been a year since I've done the New Orleans stuff. So who knows, man? But here we go. So we're looking currently at this area that is called Jackson Square. If you've ever been in New Orleans, you know what I'm talking about. You probably visited it. If you've never been in New Orleans, you should know that this was kind of the center. If you've ever been in a lot of European cities, there's like a big, huge church. There's a lot of kind of like gardens. And that's what it kind of looks like there. This is really the center of the French Quarter, right? And if you look at, I got a little bird's eye view guy right there. Bird's eye view, kind of. I don't know if that counts as a bird's eye view. But I'm not going to be talking about this building, that building, or this building, because they are boring old religious and government buildings. I want to talk about the cool art stuff that's surrounding there. And it is this building on the side, this building on the side, and all of this kind of garden area right around over there. These two buildings on either side are known as the Pontalba Apartments. And we're going to kind of zoom in here. Actually, before we do that, I need to tell you, this is originally what you would have seen. Before the Pontalba buildings, you got the church, you got the boring buildings. All the boring buildings is what you're looking at. And then you're looking at the center. This would have been kind of a military training ground originally. They did executions there, which, by the way, if you ever plan on getting married in Jackson Square, you should know that you are actually getting married on an execution ground. It's good to keep that in mind, just in case you're thinking about getting married there. I see people getting married there all the time. I'm like, I don't know if that's as romantic as you think it is, but that's what I'm saying. So you're looking at Jackson Square. We're going to kind of zoom in to this particular building. Not that one. This one. So this building on the side, now what we're looking at is the lower Pontalba. There are those two structures. This one was called lower because it's downriver. Now this building is called the Pontalba Apartments. They're named after a woman named the Baroness Michaela Almonaster Pontalba. Now this was a woman who was born into incredible wealth. She was born in 1795, and she was born under the name Michaela Almonaster at that time. And the Almonaster family had a ton of money, real estate, big money family right there. If you were born into a big money family in 1795 and you were a woman, unfortunately in those days, you had the misfortune of people only really caring who you got married to, right? We're happy that's not the case now, but this was the fact back in the day. So the whole idea was they said, okay, who are we going to get this woman married off to? They find this family living all the way in Paris, France, and they're like, they'll probably do. Why not? This family in Paris, France, sends someone down. His name's Celeste. Don't need to worry about him too much. He comes down, and the two of them strike up a courtship for a few weeks, and they say, whatever, this is close enough. We're going to get married. They get married. They move back to France. Now, when she gets to France, her father-in-law kind of realizes that the dowry that they promised was not quite as much as he thought it would be. And there was this weird contract that actually she was going to get all of the money from the family instead of it going to the greater Pontalba family. So he's pretty upset about this. He thinks that he's kind of getting screwed. So he has a lot of antagonism towards this woman. She goes back down to New Orleans after her father dies, secures some land, works out a deal, so again, the money is still just going to her. When she goes back to France, the father-in-law at this point is like, hey, what's the deal? You're totally screwing me. And he's so crazy that he decides he's going to lock her inside of a mansion until she decides to give all the money away. And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I can handle being locked in a mansion. It's actually probably not too different than what we're going through right now, in a way. We're all kind of like the Baroness Pontalba at this point. But she says, I can handle being locked in a mansion. You're a crazy person. So she just hunkers down. She reads a lot. She becomes self-educated. Once a day they would let her out and she would take a nice long leisurely walk around the Parisian garden surrounding the mansion. And then her mother dies. The money is still kind of mostly in New Orleans. When the mother dies, this is the point where the money is to actually be transferred. And the father-in-law is playing this insane person game. And he's like, I really want all that money for my family. And he's so crazy that he decides that what he's going to do, and this is real, he takes a dueling pistol. He walks into her room and he shoots her 4 times. She survives, right? And that shouldn't be a spoiler because she built these buildings. But sometimes you get caught up in the story, you forgot that she actually survived. But she does survive. She survives. She's going to be disfigured from then on. But then the father-in-law realizes that he's made this huge mistake. He takes the same dueling pistol, shoots himself in the head. Now he's dead. He's out of the picture. And as you can all say to yourselves, I'm sure you're all saying, the Pontalba family sounds like the worst family ever. Why would you hang out with them? Don't be there anymore. She gets as quick of a release from them as she possibly can. She goes away, she goes back down to New Orleans, and that's where she spends the rest of her time. And with all this money, she decides she wants to make her mark on New Orleans. And all around in that area, is like military ground. There used to be 2 different apartment buildings on either side. And she says, you know what I want to do? I want to invest in this area. So they destroy the buildings that were on either side. She has the real estate. She builds up these new luxury apartments. Now, she doesn't just hire an architect and just sit around, read a book, and wait for it to be built. She is intimately involved with building it. Now, she didn't design it herself. This was an architect named Gallier, however you want to say it. I can't say French. But she was on a horseback going up and down being like, wait, are you doing that right? Okay, and then she was so intimately involved that she wanted on the building emblazoned her initials. So if you go down to New Orleans and you walk along those buildings on the side over there, you can actually see her initials, Almonaster Pontalba, emblazoned on all of the cast iron work on the side right over there. Now, she is not done because she says, you know what, it's cool I built these buildings, but they're looking over gross little military training ground. I don't like that at all. So she actually invests money to create a cool little park around this area too. Again, she doesn't design this either, but she does design a lot of the features all around over there, and she kind of includes them, and it's her idea to build this. And because it's her idea and her money, she gets to name it. She chooses someone who is a close personal friend of hers from her traveling back and forth, Andrew Jackson. He was the president. He's kind of an awful person. We don't need to talk too much about him. But basically, this is what's going on, and this was what's happening, and her lasting mark that she left on the French Quarter. Now, this is the center of the French Quarter. Everyone walks through there, and this is her impact on all of this right here. In the postscript afterlife of what's going on with her, you should know she sets up a lot of salons. So she does a lot of these kind of educated debates of the day. She invests in literacy. So that's kind of her whole game there as well. So she was a really cool woman, and I love talking about her. There's actually a book about her called Intimate Enemies that's really worth reading. Her name was Michaela Almonaster Pontalba. So some people maybe knew that if you were from New Orleans. I mean, the Pontalba thing, maybe you heard that while you were down there. If you're a tour guide, you definitely know that. I know there's some tour guides who are watching that. Now I'm going to switch drinks on you. But what you might not know, it's funny because usually I have time that I can walk between and drink all my water, but logistics. What you might not know is that actually in New York, there was one of the most iconic structures as well was also built by a woman. And this is kind of interesting because every single person, now not everyone knows about the Pontalba buildings, most people have seen them, but every single person knows about this next structure. And I find that almost no one knows that actually it was completed by a woman. And this was the structure that is known, big dramatic pause, as the Brooklyn Bridge, right? And a lot of people they don't realize that the Brooklyn Bridge was actually built by a woman. Now, let me tell you this. The Pontalba buildings were built in the 1850s. The 1850s is when they were kind of completed. Brooklyn Bridge was completed in the early 1880s. During this time period, let me just set the scene of what's going on. There is a legitimate public debate that's happening in America that's asking the question whether women were capable of learning things. This is literally what people are writing about in newspapers. Like, men are sitting there being like, I don't know if women can learn things or not. And meanwhile, while this debate's happening, there are women that are building buildings, building some of the biggest, most iconic bridges in the world, right? So how does this happen? And how do we not know about it, right? So, Brooklyn Bridge. What you got to know about the Brooklyn Bridge is that the Brooklyn Bridge was connecting the city of New York to the city of Brooklyn. You remember way back we were talking about the different boroughs? 2 different cities. They want to connect the 2 different cities. They talked to this guy. His name was John Augustus Roebling. He was also kind of a jerk. And they say like, hey, you know what we want you to do? We want you to build a really big bridge. We want you to design it yourself. You have a steel rope company. This is perfect. John Augustus Roebling's like, I can do that. He designs the entire bridge. Then he dies. Basically, he dies. He was kind of like along the side of the river, and he's like pointing something like that. A bridge. A boat comes in, it crushes his foot, he gets gangrene, he dies. So wah wah, oh well, that guy was he was a domestic abuser, he was awful, so we don't need to talk about him too much anyway. But it was his original design, so we have to mention him. John Augustus Roebling is dead. They're like, well, we have these plans. What are we going to do next? Let's talk to his son, Washington Roebling. Washington Roebling was most well known for being in the Civil War, and he started off as a private, ended up as a colonel, which if you know anything about military, which I don't really, but I've been told that's a really big jump over the course of 4 years. This guy was kind of this wunderkind. He's going to come in and like do everything perfectly. And Washington Roebling, the son of John Augustus Roebling, the biggest contribution he has is that he wants to employ the idea of a caisson to build this bridge. Caissons. When you're looking at the Brooklyn Bridge, you see a suspension bridge, right? So you got these suspension cables that go up and down. They all rely on these 2 different towers that are on either side. That's where the weight is going. It's so you don't need to build a bunch of columns, you can just build 2, and then you can have the suspension bridge built across. Now, in the 1870s when they're building this, you can't just like start plopping down bricks into the water and hope it arranges something cool and that's what you build on. And it's the 1870s, so you also don't like have like a super cool futuristic submarine that you can go down and just make a robot do that. So the way that they built this bridge is by using a caisson. And what a caisson is basically a wooden box upside down underwater with an air bubble inside. So you can see all these people working away, right? So all these people are working and they're digging down to get to the bedrock so they can eventually start setting the stones down there. And they're digging to put all of this mud, all of the grime, everything into this tube. Through buoyancy brings that up. So that's what they're doing to build the actual bridge, right? They got the thing down there, they're underwater. You can probably all imagine this is super dangerous, right? There are fires that break out. This is a wooden box underwater, but fires are breaking out. And there's not a great easy way to go. You have to like go through this tiny little ladder to get out. So people would die during that time. One of the biggest problems with something that was called Caissons disease. Now, Caissons disease, what we know it today, is decompression sickness or the bends. And that basically means, I think most people kind of know what that means, but if you don't know what it means, basically it means when you go from one pressure system to another, then during that time when you go from one pressurization system to another, if you go very quickly, nitrogen bubbles can actually form in your bloodstream, and those nitrogen bubbles can be deadly. They can cause paralysis. The number one person who suffered from Caissons disease in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge was Washington Roebling. This dude thinks he can basically build the bridge by himself. He's down under in the caisson himself. He's kind of digging with everyone else. He's like the man of the people. He thinks he's so great. He's like, I'm going to build the bridge basically all on my own. He's down there for 12 hours. They don't know anything about Caissons disease in this time. They go, Caissons disease? What's that? We don't know what this is. We know people get sick, and we think that it's because they're down here too long. So if you're down here too long, the best thing that they think you should do is get up as fast as possible. Go up quick. And this is the worst thing you can possibly do. You actually need to go up very slowly and do it in stages. So he's down there working for 12 hours. They say, man, get out of here, get out of here. He goes up. About a day later, it says that he feels tingly throughout his entire body. And 24 hours after that, he is paralyzed from the neck down. And Washington Roebling will never walk again for the rest of his life. Naturally, the question comes up again. Who's going to build the bridge? What are we going to do? They finally turn to the wife of Washington Roebling, Emily Warren Roebling. She's like, guys, I got this crazy plan. This plan is going to go like this. My husband is going to be off on the other side of the river, right? He's going to be off on the other side, he's going to be on the Brooklyn side. He's going to be in this kind of crazy setup where we're going to give him like a telescope. And he's going to be in his wheelchair. He's going to be looking through the telescope all the way at the bridge. And then I will act as the intermediary. I'll go from one side to the other and I'll be like, hey, what's going on? He'll tell me what to do. I'll bring the instructions. Bada bing, bada boom. Everything's going to work. This is a terrible plan. They agree to it. They think, all right, whatever, sure. We just want this bridge done. This is kind of weird, but who cares? They have her be in charge. And very quickly she realizes she's always kind of a step behind the game. So she knows that they have to do something different. And the idea that she comes up with, she doesn't quit. Instead, she decides she's going to learn bridge engineering in her spare time. She's just going to take over the entire project herself, right? She's like, whatever, I can do this, right? So she spends her time learning bridge engineering. Now her father was a bridge engineer. She went to school kind of on the side with him, with her husband, learning bridge engineering. She doesn't come out of nowhere. She kind of knows some stuff, but she learns more of it, and she basically takes over the entire project. So much so that really the person who did the most work and spent the most time on site was not John Augustus Roebling, was not Washington Roebling, was Emily Warren Roebling. She was the one who was doing all of the organizing and making sure the bridge gets built. The very first person who walks across the Brooklyn Bridge, not John Augustus Roebling, because that'd be weird, because he was dead. Not Washington Roebling, which would also be weird, because he could not walk. It was Emily Warren Roebling. She walked across holding a rooster, which in those days were apparently a symbol of victory. I don't quite get it myself, but that's what she did. And there's actually a plaque now that's on this side, on the Brooklyn side, that you can go, and her name is front and center, Emily Warren Roebling, the real person who built the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So I'm gonna give myself that point. I feel like that's a similarity. I don't know. I was thinking about this actually. I don't know any other city in the world that has one of their most iconic structures built in the mid-1800s by a female. I legitimately don't know any of them. I got two. I think I earned that point. We're going to put it on the board. Boop. And feel free to do a little water break. We got the next one. The next two are a little shorter. First two are the longest ones right there, so I'm happy that you're bearing with me. what I want to tell you next, the next one, what happens sometimes when you do tours, especially this was happening in New Orleans a lot. You do these tours and people are on vacation. And for all of us, right, we're just looking for a diversion on a Tuesday night. One idea I had originally was like, maybe we'll talk about virus stuff on this tour, but then I was like, we don't want to talk about that. Why would we talk about that? We're surrounded by that everywhere. I want to specifically not talk about that on my tour. So sorry I brought that up. But one thing that happens, you're doing these tours and people are on vacation and they just want to get away from everything. And you're talking about history and there's kind of a big elephant in the room of things you have to talk about, and they're not exactly comfortable, but you have to talk about them as well, or else you're kind of not really doing your due diligence as teaching people history, because it's not all super fun, happy times when you're talking about these things. So it's kind of sometimes a little tricky, but you do kind of need to like talk about uncomfortable topics at times, even when we're not necessarily looking for it. So probably one of the other strongest comparisons and similarities between the cities of New York and New Orleans is slavery. And both cities were very, very heavily involved in the slave trade. So we do need to spend a little time with that. And to do this, we're going to talk again about New Orleans first, and then we're going to go back to New York. But what you're looking at right over here. So this building right now is actually, it's a hotel. This was originally one of the largest slave trading markets in the entire country. It was in a hotel then as well, so it's kind of weird that it was in a hotel. They transferred it, and now it's still a hotel. They have no remnant of what any of this would have looked like. They've not saved any of this. There is now a plaque over the last few years they just put in to recognize that, but for the longest time, there was nothing that was there. This is kind of an image of what this probably would have looked like in that area. But what you need to know about New Orleans is that, and probably most of you have figured this out, but New Orleans was intimately involved in the slave trade. New Orleans in the early mid-1800s was one of the wealthiest cities in the entire country, and this was almost entirely based off of cotton. And cotton was being produced at the plantations. In fact, if you go snake up the Mississippi a little bit further, there's what's called the German coast. And the German coast was one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country in the early 1800s, and they were all plantations. And so cotton uses a lot of labor and requires a lot of very cheap labor, so obviously slavery was the way that they do this. I mean, when I say obviously, they shouldn't have, obviously, but that's what they chose at that time. That was the path that they chose immorally to do. Now, New Orleans did have a separate set of laws that was different than New York, different than a lot of the British style, and this was called Code Noir. And Code Noir translates in French to Black Code, and this basically was a set of laws surrounding all the rules surrounding slavery in New Orleans and the surrounding French areas. They said a lot of things. There's a lot of misconceptions. Sometimes people will say that they, and I'm not saying this, but other people say sometimes that this is, they'll call it the more humane version, which is absurd, obviously. And this was not humane whatsoever. So if you ever hear people kind of parroting that back, just stop them right in their tracks. Let me just tell you, there was a genuine rule under Code Noir that said the first thing they did when they caught a runaway slave is they cut off each of their ears. That was the very first thing they did. They branded them with a fleur-de-lis on their back. It only got worse from there. So this was not any sort of humane set of laws. That is patently absurd, but some people do claim that. Now, there were rules under Code Noir that are complicated, right? There was a rule that said that all slaves had to be baptized Catholic. What this means is that the French saw this as an opportunity for more Catholics, so they actually baptized all of the slaves Catholic during this time. The weird consequence of this is that if you are Catholic, you actually get the Sabbath off to practice Catholicism. So slaves in New Orleans, kinda, sorta, in a way, did have that opportunity to practice that. And for the most part, some of these other cultural events that still will be going on today come from the fact that they would leave, go outside of town, and do some early foundations of jazz work, then voodoo ceremonies, have markets. And there are a lot of great tours. If you're ever in New Orleans, by the way, there are a lot of great tours that cover all of that. That was never particularly my specialty. But there are a lot of great tours to go and take all of that and learn about a lot of what was happening during that time. Now, you do need to know that also there was a provision in Code Noir that said that there were free people of color in New Orleans as well. Free people of color, it's important to kind of realize that free people of color had more rights than slaves, but they were not as free white people in New Orleans, right? So free people of color at all times had to carry with them, if they were outside, they had to carry with them like freedom papers or a manumission. There's lots of ways they could have their freedom. Either they bought themselves out of freedom, someone else bought them out of freedom, they were born into freedom. There was someone who was a slave who usually had a relationship with usually their slave owner, that then they would be born as a free person of color. Lots of ways that would happen. They had to carry with them papers at all times. If they get caught without that, they're back on the auctioning block right there. There are instances where people would tear up the information, the papers, right in front of the person if they were caught alone, and they would still go back on the auctioning block. They were literally doing everything right. They were maybe free their entire life, and now they're into slavery right there. So this was dangerous. And so one way to try and protect yourself is that you lived around a community of people, other free people of color, to protect yourself. And so this actually starts this neighborhood in New Orleans, which is known as the Treme neighborhood. And this is an awful map, by the way. Terrible. It's just the best one I could find in the circumstances. But basically, it's kind of this area. So the French Quarter is down there, which, by the way, if you're a New Orleans person and you're watching this, you'll notice that they've marked Coops and the House of Blues. Like, why they marked those. This is a map sponsored by Coops and House of Blues. But anyway. So this would kind of be the Treme neighborhood. And this would have been, this is actually the oldest African-American neighborhood in the country. And this goes back to the late 1700s. And this is because this was originally a community of free people of color that were living in New Orleans right there. Now, brief little part about New Orleans. I do want to kind of talk, because one of the surprising things to people is that New York was very intimately involved in the slave trade as well. And this always gets passed over. People never want to talk about this. But where we were saying before was the largest slave trading post in New Orleans. This was the largest slave auction in New York. It was right in this spot. Now, when you see this is Water Street, because there used to be water right there, and this is what this would have looked like right over there, right? Would have had a slave trading port right there. Now, this was a little earlier than New Orleans. So this would have been the 1700s, late 1600s to the early 1700s. And if you want an example of just how intimately involved New York was in the slave trade, by the mid 1700s, 50% of all New Yorkers owned at least one slave. And 20% of the entire population at that time were slaves. And that ranks larger than any place in the colonies at that time, except for Charleston, South Carolina. So if you want to say something, New York was very heavily involved in the slave trade. The reason why you haven't heard about this as much is because New York ended the practice of slavery in 1827. That's like 40 years before the end of the Civil War. So they kind of tried to sweep it under the rug a little bit more. But the thing that you also have to know is that New Yorkers, even after they abolished slavery, were heavily invested in the project of slavery down south. They were invested both through mortgages and also because they needed cotton, because there was a lot of manufacturing going up here. So when the Civil War breaks out, New York City was one of the biggest holdouts going into the Civil War. They didn't want to go in, so much so that the mayor at the time, Fernando Wood, actually tried to make a play to get New York to secede from the Union as well, not to join the South, but to like be a weird little like Switzerland sort of neutral country in this whole thing. So basically, and that never went anywhere because there were other people in the state of New York that didn't like that idea whatsoever. But there were a lot of people who did not want to be in the Civil War at all that were in New York. And that's kind of an overshadowed story that people don't usually talk about. Now, when they ended the practice of slavery in New York, what happens is there's this group of people that then are emancipated and they actually form their own village. We were talking about Treme before. In New York, there were people that formed their own village, and it was called Seneca Village. And Seneca Village does not exist anymore. And that's because in the spot of Seneca Village, and this is going to take a quick second, but in the spot of Seneca Village, you'll see right there, if you don't know what you're looking at, if you've never been to New York or you don't know what this is, you've probably heard of a place called Central Park. And that's actually, Seneca Village was pre-Central Park. This is where Seneca Village would have been located. And you can actually see a map with roughly what this would have looked like. Seneca Village would have had 80% of all land-owning African Americans before it got destroyed. And the reason why it got destroyed was because New Yorkers wanted Central Park. They said, hey, we want a really big park. I'm sorry that you have this big town in the way. There was churches there. There was a cemetery there. There was all sorts of things that were going on. And this was a legitimate town. They called it a shanty town, but this was not a shanty town. This was a legitimate town. It looked something along the lines of this. And they declared eminent domain, and they made everybody leave. And this is especially harmful because at that time, if you were able to vote, you actually had to own land. And this is 80% of African Americans who owned land at that time were in Seneca Village. So this is all that's left currently. And they're trying to do more. We're putting more signs up around over there. But that would have been located in what is now today in the center, basically, of Central Park. Now, eventually then, there was another community that founded, and some of the people moved down over there, and that's called Weeksville. And if you're looking at this kind of oversized map, then this is where Seneca Village would be, and down here would be like where Weeksville would have been. And the neighborhoods that surround there would be like Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, and that's where that would have been as the other version of that. But I know it's maybe a little bit of a downer to talk about that one, but it is a similarity, and we do need to talk about that since we're talking about similarities. I do have just one more similarity, and this is kind of more of a fun one where we get to watch some videos, and this is maybe one of the most controversial points that I'm going to make. And this one, the similarity, the accent. And I know when I say, you like my drawings? So I know when I say this, then you're sitting here and you're like, Kyle, are you trying to tell me that New York and New Orleans have the same accent? Because that is literally impossible. It is literally not impossible. And that is actually exactly what I'm telling you. Now, I'm going to define my terms because there's a lot of different accents that you can kind of get into. You can get into different neighborhoods or different ethnicities in New York, and you can get to different neighborhoods or ethnicities in New Orleans. I'm going to kind of just show you a few video clips and tell you exactly what's going on here. So we get to watch some videos right here. The first one that I want to show you, context, just last week, a guy on Instagram, some dude on Instagram, he's apparently famous, I've never heard of him, I don't know anyone though. He did a competition where he wanted people to submit the best New York accent, and he had like a bracket style competition to try and see with the best New York accent. And so this guy was the winner of the best New York accent. So I think that this is fair, this is very timely. This guy right here, the winner of the best New York accent as voted on by some dude on Instagram.
Everybody tries to act like a New Yorker. And I guarantee most of them are not from New York. They're either out of state or whatever. I'm original. I was raised and born in Brooklyn. That was it. And this is how my accent is, even though I moved to Queens. But otherwise, I appreciate everybody who voted for me. And thank you. And have a good day. There's nothing else to say. So why you busting my balls now?
I love that. I love that at the end. He's just like naturally says the busting my balls or breaking my balls or whatever. So I think that that's an example. We can say that's a New York accent. I hope that that is evidence that we can say that that's a New York accent, right? I'm going to give you now, this is from a documentary about the New Orleans accent. And I hope that we can say that this is firmly a New Orleans accent. All right, so this is a short little clip from
I
that.
think for me, I was raised right here on the bayou. I lived here my whole life, and it's the way everybody around here talks.
Nobody around here thinks they got an accent. They say, look at that guy, he got an accent.
If we're excited or if we're angry, that's definitely going to give you a cue of how we're feeling. It's off of emotion. I feel like most people here in New Orleans, especially in the Civil War, we're very emotional, very passionate.
Uptown was more white or black, all African or African American. So the Creole culture is a little different than when you speak to someone from Uptown.
All right, so some of you already may be like, oh, it does sound a little similar. Maybe some of you are like, Kyle, you're crazy. That's no way that those two sound similar. I'm just going to show you a few more very quick clips to kind of prove my point and then talk about what's going on and why. So in New York, there was actually someone who made a whole documentary just about the New York accent. And yes, I watched the whole thing, and it is not necessarily the most interesting documentary, unfortunately. But I want to just show you, this was an interview from the woman, and then I'm going to show you one quick clip from that. So this is an interview from the woman who made the documentary, and brief little clip
Heather
of that.
went in thinking that accents differed from neighborhood to neighborhood and borough to borough. Is there a Brooklyn Heights accent that's different from a Canarsie or an East New York accent?
It's a little more bourgeois, more landowner type of accent.
But what this Irish American discovered is that the New York accent is more ethnic than geographic.
Oil would be Earl. Santa Claus was Santy Claus.
So one of the key points I want you to remember is that she said Earl meaning oil, right there, right? Earl meaning oil. This is another clip from the actual documentary.
There are sounds that we all recognize that are part of the New York accent.
Coffee. Coffee.
The exaggerated pucker for ooh, like you.
Fun. Ghoul. Fun ghoul.
The loss of the R after the vowel.
Water.
Okay, now one more clip that I want to show you for the movie, and then we'll talk about stuff. And this is again from that same documentary from before, and or it's the New Orleans documentary, and this is some of the same people, but just slightly later, right there.
Simple things, bomb, they call it a bum.
Your mama always said Earl.
Earl, yeah. Get a can of Earl. No, Earl lives in Chalmette. The sewer, that was the Zua.
Actually, my kids don't speak like me, but my kids weren't raised right here either. Because they say, oh, mama, the water, the water. They always make fun like that.
To me, it doesn't sound any different, but I've had people say I sound like I'm from New York, from Brooklyn, Cajun. I think a lot of times people get Cajun and Creole mixed up. I don't sound Cajun. I just sound New Orleans or Creole.
It's the accent that gives it away. Truly, when you speak to someone from New Orleans and they start to have a conversation with you, you can pick up on it and tell that they are born and
I
raised
love
in New
that at
Orleans.
the end she's basically just like, well, you know you're from New Orleans because the way you talk, and then I'm trying to make the exact opposite point right there. But what this is all about, and I hope that you're a little bit convinced that they're at least pretty similar. Linguists have actually looked into this, and there has been some research out of Virginia Tech right now that was just a few years old that says that they're astoundingly similar, and that the structures are kind of too similar, because usually the way that people tell themselves the stories of why these two cities talk very similar is because they say, well, they had very similar immigrant groups coming in about the same time, and they think that that essentially means that they have the same accent or similar accents. But what these linguists in Virginia Tech actually found out was that this is not actually accurate, and New Orleans people are going to hate me right now, but actually probably New Orleans got its accent from New York. And the way that this probably happened was that there was an increase of immigration in the early 1800s, and some of that included New Yorkers as part of the port cities coming down. And I want to just kind of show you exactly what I'm talking about. So usually when we think of New Orleans, we think of Frenchness, right? But then it's kind of this weird contradiction, because we're sitting there, we're saying like, well, New Orleans has a lot of Frenchness. People are talking about, there's all this French influence. But then when you go down there, no one speaks French down in New Orleans. So when did that happen? What's going on? How does that happen? After the Louisiana Purchase, and this becomes an American city, then Americans move down. So when I say Americans, I mean people from the Midwest, but a lot of people from the Northeast. And they settled, so when we're looking at this would be the French Quarter over here. They settled into another area of town, which is known today as the Central Business District, but in that time was called the American Sector. So you had the French people in the French Quarter speaking French, and the American people in the American Sector speaking American, right? And you got the dividing line between the two of them with Canal Street. Canal Street, one of the widest streets in the entire country. And when I say widest streets, I mean things called a street that are wide, not widest things you can drive down. This was acting as the dividing line between the two. So much so that literally in the center, that area that most people call a median down in New Orleans, call a neutral ground, because this was the neutral ground between two different groups that didn't get along very well. So still, for a very long time, until about the mid-1800s, you had French people in the French Quarter speaking French, and the American people in the American Sector speaking American. During the Civil War, then New Orleans gets invaded, and they lose very quickly in the Civil War in New Orleans. It's only about a year. They take over, and then language reforms come in during that time, because you have a lot of people from the north being like, we can't understand what a lot of these people are saying, and a lot of the language and a lot of that starts to be erased and more dominated by the Americans that had moved down. So that's why you don't really hear much of the actual French when you're in the French Quarter. There are other parts of Louisiana, which is a totally different story, and not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but basically, for various reasons, but basically, this is the general story of what's going on with New Orleans and the accent and what you're looking at right there. Guys, those are the 4 points. I forgot to mark the other one, but I hope, there's differences, I'm sure, that I said, but I'm going to claim victory, 6-3. Why not? I haven't been looking at any of the comments at all. I'm going to kind of bring this up and see if I can answer something. I don't know. I hope that some of these comments aren't like telling me I'm awful. Whoa, okay. What are we looking at right over here? There's just everybody's saying all these things. Oh, man. Okay, great. This documentary, great. Yeah, great. Fangool word, I don't know. Everybody, thanks, Brooklynese. Okay, let's go up further and see. Oh my God, I love this section. People are talking. Oh man, everybody's just talking. I don't see any questions, so I don't know if I can answer anything. But wait, 4 rounds from a dueling pistol. What year is this again? Is that 5 rounds? I'm not really sure what that was referring to, but sorry. No, I mean, I'm happy to hear the questions. When there was a question about the dueling pistol and what exactly is going on there. Dueling pistol, it was a dueling pistol. Dueling pistols were not meant to like kill anyone. Dueling pistols were meant to just kind of wound someone. Dueling, it's kind of a misconception. Just dueling for the most part has been about trying to like, you just hit someone and then it's like a kiss. And then that's why she was able to survive the dueling pistol. Built, designed, financed. Everybody's talking. Put it on the board. Water. Okay. I appreciate all these people talking. Thank you so much. Right there. Seeing if there's any other questions. Which city do I like better? Emily. I have to say, because I live in New York right now, that I have to say that, I guess. There's definitely, I love them both. But I have been living in New York and enjoying it very much, and I'd like to continue living here, which maybe transitions really well to talking about down below me. And I hope that you're all enjoyed, and I don't know how to ask this, but if you did enjoy, the way that these tours usually work is that you just pay whatever you want at the end. And it's the same thing. If you enjoyed, if you could do any one of those, Venmo, Cash App, PayPal, then that'd be really helpful. But really, whatever you got to do. I thought that seemed like a lot of reloading. What are the cross streets for the building with the first passenger elevator? That's a great question, Mr. Alex Robbins. That would be located it's on Broadway, actually. It's I forgot the other cross section just off it's been so long since I've been outside. It is called the Howitt Building. You can look that up, and Howitt is spelled Haughth, WOUT, and that's the Howitt Building. Were the technical difficulties? I don't know if there were, I'm sorry if there were technical difficulties. I don't know what's going on with this. But yeah, let me see. That's that. I can only apparently see so many. Let me do a quick little guy right here as well. Maybe see if there's a way I can look at the comments going on right here on my phone, which is a weird way to do this, I suppose. Free tours by foot. Let's see if there's any way that, well, send me some more great questions if you want. Thanks so much, guys. Well, yeah, hopefully y'all had a good time. I'm going to be signing off here, but thanks so much. I hope you all enjoyed, and feel free. I'll try and maybe answer some. If I'll go back through this, and I'll try and maybe answer some of these. But thanks so much, guys. Hopefully y'all had a good time, and I appreciate you. Thanks.